Hi again. Let's continue learning about angiosperms. Today's class is about angiosperm diversity. We're going to cover different groups in angiosperms and learn their importance. So remember, angiosperms are a type of seed plants along with gymnosperms. And however, angiosperms are going to have three main features, and these are called often the 3 Fs. That's the presence of flowers, double fertilization, and fruit. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions to review those very important characters or traits in flowering plants. We're going to learn about types of pollination. We're going to define coevolution, types of seed dispersion, the groups in plants, in angiosperms in particular, and the traits that distinguish these groups. And we're going to be talking mainly about the two groups in angiosperms. So this is the life cycle of gymnosperms and angiosperms. Again, please take a look and see some of the differences and the similarities. So I asked you to do that last class, and I hope that you have taken the time. I have explained this in detail, a lot of details in this case. This is just a seed in some pines. We have the megagametophyte. Remember, the gametophytes are always haploid. And in this seed, we have the gametophyte or megagametophyte surrounding the embryo. This is not what we have in angiosperms. In angiosperms, we're going to have a triploid tissue that forms the endosperm, and that's the food supply in angiosperms. That's one of the difference. I say the other F is, well, that's the double fertilization, right? That's the first F. The other F is the presence of a flower. We have a flower here, but what's a flower? A flower is going to be a structure, a carpel. In this case, a carpel is a modified leaf surrounding the ovules. And therefore, the ovules are not going to be naked as in gymnosperms, but they are going to be involved, or not involved, they're going to be covered by this carpel or the pistil. What's the third F? So double fertilization, flowers, and the other F is fruits, the presence of fruits, because we have this vessel or this pistil. We're going to have an ovary, and the ovary is this maternal tissue that is going to contain the ovules, as we briefly just explained. But then this ovary can transform into the fruit once that these seeds are fertilized. And in some fruits, we're going to learn later that some fruits are fleshy. Think about your tomatoes or the peaches that we were talking about before. Those are fleshy fruits. In contrast, we have other type of fruits that the ovary is still going to form them, but they are going to be dried. And we can think about some peas. They form these legumes, which are dry fruits. These are the 3 Fs that I would like you to remember as features that distinguish angiosperms. Please select the letter that represents double fertilization, and that is the egg and one sperm, right? They get fertilized, and the other one is the central cell with the 2 polar nuclei and the other sperm that is carried in these pollen tubes. So where in this life cycle can you find them? Or the closest letter that represents that stage. Okay, I hope that you answer E, because this is where it happens. Remember, from this stage that comes in the arrows in blue, we transition from the haploid stage to restore the diploid condition. So fertilization occurs right here, and in this case is double fertilization. That means one sperm fertilizes the egg at the base of this megagametophyte, and the other sperm is going to fuse with these 2 nuclei right here. So in here you can see already the 3 nuclei that are about to fuse and create this triploid cell that divides through mitosis. So here we have one cell, but then it will divide later and form multicellular endosperm that is triploid. Now, select the letter that represents the formation of the megagametophyte, that is the female gametophyte. So finding this life cycle, that. I hope that you answer C, because this is the formation of the megagametophyte. Here we have these 4 megaspores that resulted from meiosis. A represents meiosis in this figure. And then this megaspore survives, 3 of them die, and through mitosis, 3 consecutive mitotic cycles, we are gonna form a megagametophile that has 7 cells, as you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These antipodes are ephemeral, so they will die. And then we have the 7th cell is the central cell with the 2 nuclei. Okay, so this is that represents the formation of the megagametophile. Now, I want you to select the letter that represents the recognition of the tricellular microgametophile by the stigma. B, right? Yes. Right here we have this tricellular microgametophile that is the pollen. Remember, the pollen is not unicellular. It's a structure that has, in angiosperms, they usually have 3 cells. One is the vegetative cell, and the other 2 are the spermatic cells. So when the pollen lands in this stigma, remember the pistil has a stigma, a style, and ovary. The pollen is gonna get hydrated. It's gonna start resuming the metabolism. It grows this, it germinates this pollen tube that grows and grows and grows through the style and carries these 2 spermatic cells here in dark brown, and then they will reach the ovule. So, but B is the right answer for this question. Now let's learn about pollination. So pollination is gonna be this process by which pollen gets transferred from one anther or from the anther to the stigma in angiosperms, right? Because gymnosperms don't have stigmas or anthers. The pollination can be biotic, and that means by living things. So living things are going to be carrying the pollen and transferring it to a different place. In this example, we have bees that are covered with pollen, and they are the vector transferring the pollen from the anthers to the top of the stigma. But there are other things that can disperse pollen, and so animals do that. So bees, moths, bats, birds, ants, other animals carry the pollen around. Abiotic factors can also transfer the pollen, and those are non-living things such as wind or water. And the wind pollinated will disperse them into the air. And if you are allergic to pollen, you know what I'm talking about. You might be very sensitive to this adaptation of angiosperms. Also, gymnosperms have wind pollination, right? Disperse their pollen by these currents of air. And many other trees have this, but also grasses. Grasses are adapted to disperse the pollen by wind. Other abiotic factors can disperse, or other plants can disperse their pollen by water. In this case, you can see a car that is covered with this pollen that is coming from some plants or nearby trees. Then they can really produce a lot more of pollen compared to the amount of ovules that they produce. In biotic pollination, we have insects that help angiosperms or other animals that help angiosperms to reproduce with members of the same species that are physically distant. And many angiosperms are going to lure insects with nectar such that the plant and the pollinator will benefit. So that's a mutualistic relationship. So the biotic factors are very, very wide. And here we have the example of pollination by moths or butterflies. The butterflies are attracted to some particular type of flowers in which they use this proboscis to suck the nectar from the flower. Moths are usually attracted to white flowers, and they pollinate at night. Pollination can occur by bats, and same as moths, they are active at night, so they are nocturnal. And in this example, we have this long-nosed bat that likes to eat the nectar from this cactus. This moth that I described just before, it's attracted to some yuccas. So this is the yucca flower. Yuccas are monocotyledons, and we're going to learn in few slides what does that mean. But just remember, yuccas are an example of monocots. This is an example of dispersion by bees. This is the same bee that we saw in the slide before. But in here, we have also the dandelion, this amazing plant that grows everywhere in the world. And it's considered a weed, but actually it has a lot of cool properties and it's edible. This dandelion, if you see it under UV light, it will look like this. So our eyes see dandelions as this strong yellow flower, but bees actually will look the dandelion like this, more white and reddish. So bees have this vision in UV, and flowers have evolved different patterns to attract the bees and get the rewards. So the bees will get the nectar and pollen, and in return, the plant is gonna transfer the pollen to another plant. In this example, we have pollination by birds. Hummingbirds are very specialized. They usually target tubular plants, or plants that have these structures that are very long, and they are able to drink this nectar using their long beak that they have. Other plants are pollinated by flies, and this is an example. The carrion flower is pollinated by these flies. I'm not divergent from the class, but I want you to ask if you know what a forensic entomology or forensic entomology means. In forensic entomology, scientists use the development of flies, the larvae of the flies, to determine the death or the time of the death of a decomposing corpse. It could be a human or other things that you could actually track how long ago the larvae or the eggs were deposited. And so these larvae will eat the flesh. And this is something that the flowers mimic. So that means that these flowers, all of these that are attracting flies, are tricking the fly to think that they are producing, that they are flesh, and they smell really strong and really bad. So the flies come looking for the flesh. Some of them even look reddish, like, flesh. And the flies explore around, finding the place to deposit their eggs there, but then they get tricked. They don't get anything in return. So there is no food for the larvae. But then the flies carry the pollen from one flower to another one. So that's a non-mutualistic pollination. In the examples that I mentioned before, the bees, for example, get something in return. So they pollinate, but they also get something in return. In these examples, the flies don't get anything in return. This is the largest flower on Earth. That's the carnion flowers, a type of carnion flowers. It's Rafflesia. And Rafflesia it's this large. It's the largest flower, as I said. It grows in Southeast Asia. And you could see the size compared to these children around. This is very stinky and also is pollinated by bees, but it is pollinated by flies. This looks larger, right? This is the corpse flower. It's also pollinated by flies and I think some beetles. They also get attracted, these insects get attracted because of the smell, and they are looking for this flesh, the decomposing flesh, but they get tricked. The species is Amorphophallus titanium, and I won't describe. If you are curious, look at what does Amorphophallus mean. Well, titanium is just very large, but that's also kind of funny to see what the name of this plant and the structure associated to this flower. There are a lot of type of interactions that are non-mutualistic pollinations. This is one example of orchids. The off-freeze orchids trick some of the longhorn bees to think that they are actually female bees, but they are actually not. And this is what happens. So these bees or these wasps look for the mate, and you can see that the flower actually resembles a little bit these insects, the female bees or the female wasp of this species. So when these bees or these flies try to mate, they carry the female, and this is what they are trying to do, to carry the female. And by doing that, there are some pollen grains in these staminoids right here, and these staminoids are going to get transferred on the bees or on the wasp and the next time that this insect gets tricked, is going to be fertilizing the next plant. So this is how this staminoid gets attached to the forehead of the bee, or this structure in the bee. So we have been discussing types of pollinations, and it's very important to realize that a lot of these mechanisms have evolved parallel. And that means that the structure of the flower has evolved as well as the structure of the pollinators. And in some cases, that relationships occur very closely. And that's what we know as coevolution. So coevolution is the joint evolution of interacting species. So in this case, a plant or an insect, or a plant and a bird, or other type of interactions. And those species interact in response to selection imposed by each other. So the shapes and the sizes of flowers are going to change and correspond to, well, are going to change in response of the pollinator, but are also correspond to the pollen transporting part of the animal that is pollinating it. So as I was explaining before, think about the hummingbird, and I say that hummingbirds usually pollinate tubular plants or tubular flowers, right? So they have this long beak that enters, and it's almost like a key in a door that just fits very nicely. Not all of the plants have this precision, or not all of the interactions. But one example is the orchid flower, or Darwin's orchid flower. Darwin predicted that this orchid, okay, so there is an orchid that has a long structure that is almost 28 centimeters long, and it will have the nectar at the bottom. What will be a pollinator that will pollinate this plant? So when Darwin ran into this issue, he hypothesized or predicted that a moth that will have a 28 centimeters long tongue will be the pollinator. And it was very interesting because the plant was discovered first, and then the moth was discovered. And this is the moth with the long proboscis that will reach this structure in the orchid flower. Just to review some concepts, Charles Darwin, blank, A, explained how a species could evolve by means of natural selection. B, made a trip on the beagle. C, predicted the pollinator of the orchid, Angiosperm sesquipedale. D, explained that all species descended from a common ancestor. All of the above for E. E is the right answer, all of the above. So Darwin was involved in all of these points. So we have covered biotic interactions or biotic pollination in plants, in angiosperms. Now let's talk about abiotic pollinations. The abiotic pollination by wind occurs in several plants. This is one example. In the hazel, staminated flowers. Some, for example, populus is also pollinated by wind. Oaks are pollinated by wind. Grasses are pollinated by wind. So pollen is very, very, can be very abundant at the peaks, abundant in the air at the peak of the pollination. Another way to pollinate is by transferring the pollen grains by water. In this case, we have a sea plant, or a plant of the genus Thalassia. And in this plant has returned to live in the sea. So we talk constantly about how plants colonize Earth. However, some lineages of plants have returned to live in aquatic environments. In order to disperse the pollen, they need to adapt to these conditions. And they have adapted by modifying their pollen such that they can be, they can bounce in the water, and they can reach the female flowers and then fertilize the eggs in the female flowers. Please answer this question. About 20% of all angiosperms are wind pollinated. Since their reproductive success doesn't depend on attracting pollinators, there has not been selective pressures on A, colorful petals, B, scent flowers, C, nectar production, D, 2 answers are correct, E, 3 answers are correct. So 3 answers are correct. In, for example, grasses, we don't have colorful petals. Look at your grass in front of your house or in the neighbor's house, and you won't see any showy, colorful flower. So they don't have that because they don't need to attract these pollinators, right? They are wind pollinated. The other thing is that they don't have to spend energy and resources to produce scents that will also attract the pollinators. And lastly, they don't have to invest in nectar to reward the pollinator to do the pollination transfer or the pollen transfer. So 3 answers are correct. So fruits are going to be a mature ovary. And the fruit protects the dormant seeds. And the purpose of the fruit is going to be helping with dispersal. We have different types of fruits depending on how many structures are involved in the formation of the fruits. For example, if just one ovary of one flower is involved on it, then we will say that it is a simple fruit. But how about if we have one flower that has multiple ovaries? In this case, we have a raspberry, and raspberries or strawberries are an aggregate fruit. That is the result of a flower that has multiple pistils and also multiple ovaries as a result. The third type is when we have an inflorescence. An inflorescence, it's a group of flowers all together. And in this example, we see a pineapple that has multiple flowers. They have some very nice colorful flowers in purple. And this will be a multiple fruit when you actually have multiple flowers. An aggregate fruit is going to have one flower with several carpels or several pistils actually. The simple fruit is just one flower but with one pistil. And in this example, the accessory fruit is when the fleshy part of the fruit, as in the apple, is a result of other structure but the ovary. So the ovary is right here in this flower, but then the actual part that we eat in the apple comes from the receptacle. And the receptacle is this structure, if you remember, is the structure in which the ovary, the stamen, the pistil, and the petals and sepals get attached. This part right here at the base and surrounding the ovary, in this case, as the ovary is inferior, is the receptacle. And that becomes part of this apple that we eat. So it's not the ovary, what we eat is the receptacle. So this is an accessory fruit, and the accessory is because it's not the ovary, but an accessory that forms the the fleshy part of the fruit, or part of the fruit. Fruits then, in biology and in botany in particular, are anything that it's a mature ovary, or that has a mature ovary. In that sense, avocados are fruits, chilies are fruits. In this case, we have the dragon fruit, we have the cocoa, we have the jackfruit as well. I forgot the name of this one, but that's a different type of fruit. The jackfruit or durians are actually very delicious, but very stinky. And in some places in Asia, for example, you are not allowed to enter if you carry some of these fruits. That's illegal because they are very stinky. But if you have tried them, you know that they are very delicious. The fruits also can be dispersed by wind or by water. So now think about these examples. So we have dispersal by water in the case of the coconuts. Remember when I was explaining that the coconut has an endosperm that is the white part of the coconut that we eat, and also when it's young we can drink the water, the coconut water. It's actually a triploid tissue, which means it's the endosperm. But surrounding this structure, we have the ovary that transform in this really hard and tough cover. And inside we have a hole. This hole then, it makes the coconut buoyant, and it can float in the sea and get transported to a different island or a different part of the coast, that when it reaches that part, it can germinate. And it has all of these food supply that will guarantee the establishment of the seedling. Wind dispersal can happen also in the fruits. This is one of the maples. The maples form this structure. This one, it's coming from the ovary. This winged fruit, this structure, it's coming from the ovary. So this fruit gets dispersed by wind. Dandelions are actually an inflorescence, and each little flower later becomes this structure, which has the one seed inside of the ovary, and all of this development is this aerial kind of umbrella. It's coming from the pistil, and inside of here, at the bottom in the ovary, we'll have the one seed. This is also dispersal, but of the whole plant, the tumbleweed, which gets carried by winds in arid places. Dispersal by animals is very common. Some plants actually require the seeds to go through the gut of an animal, because in the stomach, for example, we have a pH that is very acidic, and that helps to kind of soften the seed coat. Remember, these seed coats can be very, very hard and help the embryo to be protected. But then sometimes they inhibit the germination of the embryo. So the animals need to eat them in order for the germination to occur later on. And if you think about it, this is also very clever, because some animals, well, they will poo and they will disperse the seeds, but also the seeds will be embedded in the feces. In this case, we have some seeds that were eaten by a bear, and this black bear later had these feces, and the seeds will have this nutritious environment in which if it germinates, now the plant will have higher chances to become established. Other plants have animal dispersal, but not because they reward the animal by having fleshy fruits, but more because the animals or the plants have some hooks, such as in the cockleburs. In here, you can see this dog that is covered with these cockleburs that got attached, and the fruits get hitchhiked by the dog. So if you have dogs and you have walk around with your dog, you probably know what I'm talking about. Or sometimes we carry these type of fruits in our pants or in our socks, even our shoes. They get attached there. Other animals disperse the seeds or the fruits as well, but they don't eat it immediately. So for example, the squirrels or some birds or some rodents, sometimes some mice, I mean, sometimes they hatch or they collect the seeds and they bury the seeds and they forget about the seeds. And that's a mechanism by which plants can get dispersed. Ants can also carry the seeds, and some of these seeds have a structure called aerial that the ants get attracted, and they will carry the seeds from this structure and use them as a food source. As I mentioned, the angiosperms originated at least 140 million years ago, and they have dominated the terrestrial ecosystem by 100 million years ago. The Chinese fossil of this Archaeophroctus, it's dated 125 million years ago. Since then, we have this diversity. This is Archaeophroctus sinensis. It was found in China. And you can see that in this fossil, the reconstruction, the cartoon of this fossil in the left, shows carpels and also stamens. Another important fossil is the one of the Benititiales. And Benititiales are actually close relatives to angiosperms, even closer than the gymnosperms. So we say that the split of the gymnosperms and the lineage carrying the angiosperms diverged 300 million years ago, and several species evolved in this time. And later we have this group Benititiales, which is, we are not completely sure, but that's what we think, that the Benititiales split from angiosperms more than 200 million years ago. And most recently, all of this diversity on angiosperms just exploded. The basal angiosperms, and I want to emphasize that basal is a word that your book uses. However, we don't refer to them as basal or less advanced or less complex than others. All of the species are adapted to their environment. So there is no such thing as basal, but we can refer to them as older lineages. So older lineages or early evolving lineages are Amborella trichopoda from New Caledonia, water lilies, such as the nymphia, and the star anise and other relatives of the genus Elysium, for example, the star anise. All of those are early evolving flowering plants, this lineage. Amborella trichopoda, it's a plant that is dioecious, meaning that it has female and male plants. And water lilies are these gorgeous, magnificent type of plants with showy flowers and adapted to live in aquatic environments. You can see how resistant they are if you put a baby on these leaves, that they can support the baby and prevent them from sink. So they have these adaptations to float and photosynthesize. This is the star anise, Elysium verum. It's used to cook. It's an aromatic spice. And another lineage is the magnolids. Magnolids are more closely related to monocots and eudicots. So magnolids are more closely related to both monocots and eudicots than basal angiosperms, or the early evolving angiosperms that I mentioned, such as Amborella or the water lilies or the star anise clade. Examples of magnolids are laurels, black pepper. Black pepper, if you use black pepper, if you add it in your meal, you know what I'm talking about. Magnolias, the plants that have some very nice white flowers. We have some in campus. Those are magnolias. All of them belong to this group, Magnolid. These are the magnolias. These are the flower. And look at all of the stamen in this flower. And look at the styles. So these are stigmas and the styles. We have multiple pistils in this flower. And once that it gets pollinated, this flower becomes this fruit. And this fruit has seeds inside. So this is a dried fruit that opens and releases these seeds. So this is the seed. The red structures are the seeds. What magnolias have a blank fruit. A, simple fruit. B, aggregated fruit. C, multiple fruit. D, accessory fruit. Or E, complex fruit. Okay, the right answer is aggregated, and that means one flower with multiple pistils, or this is the case of the magnolia, aggregate fruit. Now let's talk about these other two groups, monocots and eudicots. This is the groups that contain the highest diversity of angiosperms. So as I mentioned before, in your book it says that there are 250,000 living species of angiosperms, but we really think that it's more about 300,000 or more. When previously angiosperms were divided into two main groups. The first one was considered the monocots that have one cotyledon, and the plants with two cotyledons were considered one group, a different group. However, DNA studies suggest that dicots are actually a paraphyletic group. And because of that, now we call them monocots and eudicots. So in other words, what we refer as basal angiosperms, as well as magnolids and eudicots, all of them have two cotyledons, and therefore they are paraphyletic, whereas monocots only have one cotyledon. So this is seedling germinating, and you can see one leaf. That's the example of iris or some orchids or maize. And dicots will have two cotyledons, but as I said, this group is artificial. So right now we're focusing on eudicots, and these will have the two cotyledons, right? Two cotyledons emerging from the seedling. So these cotyledonary leaves. Examples of monocots include palms. And remember, palms are not cycads. Cycads are gymnosperms, and even though they look slightly similar, they are completely different. They evolved by convergence to look similar. But monocots, or palms, are monocots. Orchids are also monocots. Iris, or irises. Grasses, as we mentioned before, are also monocots. Eudicots include most angiosperms. And in particular, the largest family is the sunflower family with, I think, 30,000 or more species of angiosperms in that family. So yes, daisies, or the sunflower family, has a lot of diversity, a lot of species in this family. But legumes belong also to this eudicot group, roses, oaks, etc. Some of the main differences between monocots and eudicots are at the embryo level. As I mentioned, eudicots have two cotyledons and monocots have one. The leaf venation is another feature that distinguishes them. The leaf venation in monocots is usually, but not always, parallel. And in eudicots, it's usually net-like, as in this example. The stems of monocots are going to have a vascular tissue that is scattered. Like in here, you see all of these circles inside of the stem are the vascular tissue that has both phloem and xylem there. But in eudicots, the vascular tissue usually forms or is arranged in a ring. The roots are going to be different. In monocots, we usually have fibrous roots, and that is a root system that doesn't have a main root. Actually, they do have a main root, but it dies very early on. So all of these roots are equally important. Whereas in eudicots, we have the taproot system, in which we have a main root that is present, and this is the main root. These are secondary roots. You see how the architecture of the root is different in these two groups? Another feature that distinguishes monocots from eudicots is the opening. This opening in the pollen grain is very important. This is the area by which the pollen tube is going to emerge when the pollen is deposited in or on the stigma. Remember, the pollen tube that carries the two spermatic cells needs to emerge, and it emerges through these openings. In monocots, we have one opening, whereas in eudicots, we have 3 openings or more. And a common feature that you learn since kindergarten, I believe, is the number of organs, or the floral organs, are going to be in multiples of 3, usually in monocots, and in multiples of 4 or 5 in eudicots. So if you count the number of sepals in here, we have 5, and petals, we have 5. Whereas in this iris, we have a multiple of 3. So we have 6, right, in total. The venation, as I mentioned, in monocots, it's parallel, and this is going to have a large group. Well, actually 2 groups are orchids and grasses, and followed by palms. Some of the members of monocots that are economically important are in the grass family. So now think about what you eat today. You probably had bread, or if not cereal, made with corn. But the bread is, most of the bread that we eat has wheat, right? So grass family is very, very important. We eat it a lot. Pineapple family, banana family is also edible. And right now there is a boom in the bamboo. So this is also part of the grass family, the bamboo. Eudicots have net-like venation, and it includes members of the legume family, such as the peas or beans, and these families are economically important. More than 2/3 of Angiosperm species belong to the eudicots, so it's very diverse. Some of the economically important families are the rose family, the citrus, grapes, mangoes, the melon family, all of the zucchinis, the cucumbers, melon, watermelon, all of these species belong to this family. The nightshade family, which has tomatoes, potatoes, and other very important products that we eat, belong to that family. So we have covered the 3 lectures for this module, and remember to complete your readings and exams. Next week, we are going to be having the exam on Friday. That means that you need to complete, or we advise you to complete everything before the exam. If you don't complete them, you can still, same as last time, you are allowed to submit your assignments that are due on Sundays, but please remember to try to complete them, because you want to prepare or get prepared for this exam, and everything up to next week's class is going to be included in the exam. That means from the very first class until until next week's classes. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.